until they found her. Sydney, bloody and rain-soaked in a too-big coat. Sydney who wasn't human. Sydney, who Mitch didn't know what to do with, how to handle. Sydney, and now a different kind of fear. Loss. And tucked into all of that, like a slip of paper in a book, a last memory. Another blonde girl. A body buried by fire. A choice smothered by regret. "Sorry," June heard herself say again, even as the man's memories flashed through her head. "My aim is just awful." "Don't worry about it," said Mitch, radiating kindness, warmth. He sat back in the grass with his book and smiled. June smiled back and said goodbye, her focus already turning to the girl under the tree. Unknown number. "I forgot to tell you. Unknown number. My name is Sydney." June cradled the cell phone in her palm. She already knew the girl's name, of course, but it was better coming from her. June wanted things to happen naturally, even if they hadn't started that way. "Nice to meet you, Sydney," she wrote back. "I'm June." Good, she thought with a smile. Now they could be proper friends. Roman numeral 5. 3 weeks ago. The Heights. The elevator chimed as it reached the 14th floor. June stepped out into the hall and approached the cream-colored door. She half expected to find a spare key on the doorframe or under the mat, but there was nothing. No matter. 2 thin bits of metal and a half-minute later, she was in. Marcella Riggins' apartment was pretty much what she expected. Leather sofa, plush white rug, copper sconces. All money, no soul. Still, there were a few surprising touches. The chunk of wood missing from the bedroom door. The rotted line like burned paper showing the path of destruction. The tiny glittering pieces of glass on the counter and strewn across the floor. But the thing June inspected first was the record player. It was the kind rich people bought for decoration instead of function. But a small stack of albums leaned beside it, even if they too were just for show. And June flipped through until she found something upbeat, savoring the scratch of the needle. Music poured into the apartment. June closed her eyes and swayed a little. The song reminded her of summer, of laughter and champagne, the cold splash of pool water, of veranda curtains and strong hands, and the scrape of the slate walk against her cheek, and... The song scratched to a stop as June removed the needle. The past was the past. Dead and buried. She wandered through the bedroom, drew an absent hand across the clothes in the closet, half of which appeared to have fallen victim to Marcella's wrath. Her cell buzzed. "Sid, I'm so bored. Sid, I wish I was there." June wrote back. "June, you could be. Sid, I can't." The words were routine at this point, even if they both knew the outcome wasn't really possible. After all, June could be anyone, while Sydney, it seemed, could only be herself. Conspicuous in its constancy, Sydney's presence would negate June's own advantage. And of course there was the matter of the others. Of Mitch, and more importantly, of Victor. June hadn't at first understood the nature of that relationship, or the degree of Sydney's attachment, until Sydney finally broke down and told her everything. It was last fall, and they were on one of their late-night calls, each of them perched on a rooftop, cities apart, but under the same sky. Sid was tired of living out of a backpack, tired of never settling down, tired of not getting to live a normal life. June had wondered, of course, why they moved around so much, had spent a good long while assuming they were on the run. But there was more. She knew it, and she'd been waiting for Sid to confide in her. That night, she was tired enough to tell the truth. "Victor's looking for someone who can help him." "Help him how?" "He's sick." A long pause. "I made him sick." "How could you make him sick?" "I thought I could save him. I tried, but it didn't work. Not the way it should have." June hesitated then. She'd seen Sydney save small animals, knew what her intervention meant. "You resurrected Victor?" The answer was barely a whisper. "Yes. I've brought people back before." And then still so softly. "But it's harder when they're like us. You have to reach so much farther into the dark. I thought I grabbed hold of all the thread, but it was frayed, pieces everywhere. And I must have missed one, and now his power isn't working right." That last bit, like an opening in armor, a chance to ask the question that had plagued June since the day she brushed arms with the man in black. The mystery of his power. She'd glimpsed something in Mitch's mind, the vague shape of it anyhow, had gleaned more from the big guy's fear, and from the careful way Sydney spoke, that Victor could do more than start cars or solve puzzles with his eyes closed. "What is Victor's power?" she asked now. Heard the girl swallow audibly. "He hurts people." A small shiver. "Sydney," June said slowly, "has he ever hurt you?" "No." And then, "Not on purpose." Anger cut through June like a knife. Anger, and the grim determination to pry Sydney free, from Victor's vice. So far, she hadn't succeeded. It didn't stop her from trying. "If you ever want to leave?" But June always knew the answer before he came. June sighed. Sydney still blamed herself for Victor's situation, and until June could find a way to separate the girl from her shadow, Sid would say those same 2 words. June put the phone away, turning her attention back to the task at hand, and the issue of Marcella Riggins. She plucked a framed photo from the dresser. No question, the woman was a stunner. Black hair, pale skin, long limbs, pretty in the way that made nothing else about you matter. June had been that kind of pretty, once. It was overrated. June tossed the photo onto the bed and went to the window, intending to keep watch for Marcella. Instead, she spotted a black van idling at the mouth of an alley. That wouldn't do. She donned the Mr. Gosterly costume a second time and went back downstairs. As she stepped through the revolving doors, she shed the aspect in favor of something even less form-fitting. A middle-aged man, haggard from too many nights spent sleeping rough. The homeless fellow staggered, as if drunk, and caught himself against the hood of the idling van. Then, without looking up, began to unbuckle his worn belt and relieve himself against the vehicle. A door swung open, slammed closed. "Hey!" shouted a voice, grabbing her borrowed body from behind. June turned and stumbled forward into the soldier, as if losing his balance, and as she did, a switchblade slid out from her fingers with a neat little snick. She drove the blade up into the soldier's throat, then eased his body down against the alley wall. 1 down. How many more to go? Meanwhile, across town, Marcella sat on the patio of Le Soleil, sipping her latte as rain dripped from the awning and 100 strangers passed beneath black umbrellas. She couldn't shake the feeling she was being watched. She was, of course, used to being noticed, but this felt different, intrusive, and yet there was no obvious source. Despite her concern, Marcella wasn't in disguise. Lying low had never been her style. But she'd conceded to a more subtle aesthetic, with her black hair and a simple high ponytail, her trademark stiletto pumps exchanged for more functional heeled black boots. Her nails, freshly painted gold, rapped against the side of her cup as she studied the subway station across the street. Marcella mapped out the station in her mind, envisioning the escalators that led down 1 level and then 2, terminating at the bank of storage lockers that ran along a white tile wall. The locker in question was one of 5 they had, scattered across Merritt. It had been Marcella's idea to skim off the funds in case a situation arose. Admittedly, she'd never envisioned a situation quite like this. A siren wailed, and Marcella's fingers tensed on her coffee cup as the patrol car whipped around a nearby corner. But it surged past without stopping, and Marcella exhaled and brought the latte to her lips. It was strange. In the days since her confrontation with Marcus, she'd been on edge, waiting for the cops to show up at any moment. She wasn't a fool. She knew they were the ones who'd kept her survival a secret, knew her departure from the hospital was anything but subtle, and yet no one showed up, either to kill or to collect her. She wondered what she would do when they did. "Anything else?" asked the waiter. Marcella smiled up at him from behind her sunglasses. "Just the check." She paid and stood, flinching a little as she did. The burns were healing, but her skin was still tender and tight, aching with every motion. A useful reminder of Marcus's crime, and a shortcut to summoning this new power, if and when she needed it. Marcella crossed the street and into the station. She made her way to the lockers, found the number, the day they met, and spun the code Marcus had habitually used into the combination lock. It didn't open. She tried a second time, then sighed. Her husband continued to disappoint her. Marcella wrapped her fingers around the lock and watched it rust away, the metal crumbling in her palm. The door swung open, and she pulled a stylish black and gold purse from the cubby. She drew the zipper back and examined the stacks of cash, totaling $50,000. It wasn't enough, of course, but it was a start. For what? She asked herself. The truth was, Marcella wasn't sure what to do next, where to go, who to become. Marcus had gone from being a foothold to a shackle, a hindrance. Marcella took the purse and made her way back up to the street and hailed a cab. "Where to?" asked the driver as she slid into the back seat. Marcella sat back and crossed her legs. "The Heights." The city slid past. Innocuous enough, but when Marcella climbed out of the cab 10 minutes later, she felt it again. That prickle, like eyes against the back of her neck. "Mrs. Riggins," said Ainsley, the Heights concierge. His voice was steady, but his gaze lingered on her as she crossed the lobby, a careful tension in his face. He was standing too stiff, too still, working too hard at seeming calm. Shit, thought Marcella, stepping smoothly into the elevator. As it rose, she unzipped the black and gold bag and reached past the money, fingers closing around the familiar grip of a handgun. Marcella drew the weapon out, admiring the sleek chrome finish as she ejected the clip, checked the rounds, slid the safety off, each gesture performed with studied ease. It was like wearing heels, she thought, racking the slide. Just a matter of practice. Roman numeral 6. 2 years ago. Merritt Armory. It was her birthday, and they had the whole place to themselves. Marcella could have picked a restaurant, a museum, a movie theater, any place she wanted, and Marcus would have found a way to make it hers for the night. He'd been surprised when she'd chosen the gun range. She'd always wanted to learn how to shoot. Her heels clicked across the linoleum, the bright fluorescence glaring down on case after case of weapons. Marcus laid a dozen handguns on the counter, and Marcella ran her hands over the different models. They reminded her of tarot cards. When she was young, Marcella had gone to a carnival, snuck into a little tent to learn her fortune. An old woman, the perfect image of a mythological or mythical crone, had spread the cards, and told her not to think, just to reach for the one that reached for her. She had drawn the Queen of Pentacles. The fortune-teller told her it symbolized ambition.
"Power," said the woman, "belongs to those who take it."
Marcella's fingers closed around a sleek, chrome Beretta.
"This one,"
she said with a smile. Marcus took up a box of bullets and led her through into the shooting gallery. He lifted a target, a full silhouette, head to toe, and marked by rings, and clipped it to the line. He hit a button, and the target skated away 5, 10, then 15 meters before it stopped and hung suspended, waiting. Marcus showed her how to load the magazine. It would take her months to manage without chipping a nail, and offered her the gun. It felt heavy in her hand, lethal. "What you're holding," he said, "is a weapon. It has only one purpose, and that's to kill." Marcus turned Marcella to face the target and wrapped himself around her like a coat, tracing the lines of her body with his own. His chest to her shoulders, his arms along her arms, hands shaping hers around the gun. She could feel his excitement pressing against her, but the gun range wasn't just a kinky setting for a birthday fuck. There would be time for that later, but first, she wanted to learn. She leaned her head back against her husband's shoulder. "Darling," she breathed, "a little space." He retreated, and Marcella focused on the target, aimed, and fired. The shot rang out across the concrete range. Her heart raced from the thrill. Her hands thrummed from the kickback. On the paper target, a neat hole had been torn in the right shoulder. "Not bad," said Marcus, "if you're shooting an amateur." He took the gun from her hand. "The problem," he said, casually ejecting the magazine, "is that most professionals wear vests." He checked the rounds. "You shoot them in the chest, and you're dead." He slid the ammo back in with a swift, violent motion. His hands moved over the gun with the same short, efficient strokes he so often used on her. A confidence born out of practice. Marcus swung the gun up, sighted for an instant, and then fired 2 quick shots. His hand barely moved, but the distance between the bullets could be measured in feet, not inches. The first struck the target in the leg. The second burrowed a neat hole between the cutout's eyes. "Why bother with the first shot?" she asked, "if you know you can make the second?" Her husband smiled. "Because in my line of work, darling, the targets don't stand still. And most of the time, they're armed. Accuracy is much harder in the moment. The first shot throws the target off guard. The second is the kill." Marcella pursed her lips. "Sounds messy." "Death is messy." She took back the gun, squared herself toward the target, and fired again. It tore the paper several inches to the right of the head. "You missed," said Marcus, as if that wasn't obvious. Marcella rolled her neck, exhaled, and then emptied the rest of the clip into the paper target. Some of the shots went wide, but a few punctured the paper head and chest, stomach and groin. "There," she said, setting the gun down. "I think he's dead." A moment later, Marcus's mouth was on hers, their shuffling feet scattering the spent cartridges as he took her up against the back wall. The sex was brief and rough, her nails leaving lines beneath his shirt, but Marcella's attention kept sliding past her husband to the ruined target, hanging like a shadow at his back. Marcella didn't shoot any more that night, but she went back to the range alone, week after week, until her aim was perfect. Roman numeral 7. 3 weeks ago. The Heights. The elevator doors opened, and Marcella stepped out, one hand resting on the gun inside her bag. Out of the corner of her eye, she glimpsed a man walking casually toward her. He looked innocuous enough, dressed in a pullover and slacks, but black combat boots showed beneath the hems. "Marcella Riggins?" he asked, continuing his slow advance. She turned toward him. "Do I know you?" "No, ma'am," he said with a smile. "But I was hoping we could talk." "About what?" she asked. His smile stiffened, set. "About what happened the other night." "What happened?" she echoed, as if racking her memory. "Do you mean when my husband tried to burn our house down around me?" Or when I melted his face off with my bare hands. The man's expression stayed steady, even. His steps slowed, but didn't stop, each stride closing the gap between them. I think you should stay there. Marcella drew the gun from her bag, not all the way, just enough to let him see the chrome polish along the back of the barrel. Come on now, he said, lifting his hands as if she were a wild animal, something to be corralled. You don't want to make a scene. Marcella tipped her head. What makes you think that? She swung the gun up and fired. Her first shot took the man in the knee. He gasped, buckled, and before he could even reach for the weapon holstered at his ankle, she fired a second shot into his head. He collapsed, blood staining the runner. She heard the steps behind her too late, and turned in time to see a dark figure, a soldier, armored head to toe in black tactical gear. Turned in time to see the arc of electricity leap from the end of a baton with a static hiss. Marcella's hand shot up and caught the weapon just as it skimmed her shoulder. Pain tore through her, sudden and bright, but Marcella tightened her grip, fingers flaring red. The strange light wrapped up over her wrist, a perfect mirror of the rot spreading through the instrument. Then, the hand holding it. The attacker let go and staggered back with a yelp, clutching their arm, and Marcella slammed her heel into their chest, sending them to the floor. She knelt on top of them, fingers closing around the front of the soldier's helmet. Come on, darling, she said. Let me see your face. The helmet warped, weakened, until she could tear the faceplate away. A woman stared up at her, pain contorting the lines of her face. Marcella tisked. Not a good look, she said, wrapping her hand around the woman's exposed throat to stifle her scream as her body withered. Then, the harsh metal sound of someone racking around. Marcella looked up and saw a third soldier, his gun already leveled at her head. Her own weapon sat discarded several feet away. She dropped it when she went to catch the baton. Stand up, ordered the soldier. Marcella considered him. He was so focused on her, he didn't register the shape moving behind him, not until it reached out and wrapped an arm around his throat. The shape, a man built like a heavyweight boxer, wrenched the soldier back, and the gun went off, a steel dart grazing Marcella's cheek before burying itself in the wall behind her head. The soldier didn't get a chance to fire again. The other man gripped the soldier's mask and wrenched it sideways, breaking his neck with an audible crack. When he let go, the soldier's body crumpled to the floor. Marcella hadn't wasted any time. She was up again, the gun back in her hand, and trained on the man who, for his part, seemed unfazed. Careful now, he said, in a broad, musical voice. Shoot me, and you'll just kill a 23-year-old from the suburbs who loves his ma. Who are you? She demanded. Well, now, that's a little complicated. And then, in front of Marcella's eyes, the man changed, rippled, and was gone, replaced by a young woman with loose brown curls. You can call me June. Marcella's eyes narrowed, and the woman smiled at her surprise. Didn't think you were that special, did you? She looked down at the three corpses, arms crossed. You shouldn't leave these here for anyone to find. She knelt, and just like that, she was the boxer again, getting his hands under a pair of shoulders. Marcella stared down in genuine surprise. June looked up, impatient. A little help? Marcella pressed a hand towel to her cheek, her gun balanced on the edge of the sink. The thin line was still weeping blood. She checked her reflection in the bathroom mirror and hissed in annoyance. The cut would heal, but they'd ruined a perfectly nice shirt. Who are you? Marcella called over her shoulder to the living room, where the shapeshifter was patting down the soldiers' bodies. I told you, June called back in a lilting voice. No, said Marcella. You really didn't. She tossed the cloth aside and took up her gun, returning to the living room. The bodies lay side by side on the floor, the last, the one missing half its skull, staining her polished wood. Death is messy. Don't be precious, said June, reading her face. I doubt he'll want to hang about now anyway. Fucking cops, muttered Marcella. These aren't cops, said June. They're trouble. She tore a small black patch from the shoulder of one uniform and held it up for Marcella to see. Or more accurately, they're Eon. Marcella raised a brow. The patch itself was unmarked, save for a simple black X ghosted on the cloth. Is that supposed to mean something to me? June rose to her feet. It should, she said, stretching. It stands for Extraordinary Observation and Neutralization. Extraordinary. EO. That's us. Which makes them the neutralizers. She nudged a body with the tip of her shoe. Sharks that come swimming when you make a splash. You're lucky I found you, Miss Riggins. Marcella took up the half-ruined helmet. She upended it, shaking out the ash. How did you find me? Ah, Bethany. Marcella scowled at the memory of her ex-friend, her late husband's late mistress. Bethany. Perky young thing. Tits up to here. I know who she is. She liked to talk. A lot.
About Marcus, and the place he'd put aside for her.
Marcella didn't realize she was gripping the helmet until it fell apart in her glowing hands.
And you?
She asked, dusting her palms.
Are you looking for my husband? Oh, he's well dead. You made sure of that.
June whistled.
That's quite a talent you have there. You don't know the half of it. I know you walked into a room with 5 men sitting round a table playing cards, and when you left, 2 were ash, 1 had a bullet in his head, and the other 2 were saying all kinds of strange things.
June smiled conspiratorially.
Next time, you should probably just kill them all. No good having survivors running their mouths. See, Marcella,
she added, stepping closer.
The problem is, one of those men, the ones you killed that night, he was mine. My condolences,
said Marcella dryly. June waved her hand.
Mine to kill. And in my line of work, it's poor form to take a bounty off another.
Marcella raised a brow.
You're a hitman. Hey now, no need to be sexist. We come in all shapes. But yeah, sure. And the way I see it, you owe me a death.
Marcella crossed her arms.
Is that so? It is. Anyone in particular? Matter of fact, I think you know him. Anthony Hutch.
Marcella bristled at the name. A memory of the rooftop party, Hutch's wet, wandering gaze, his patronizing smile. June was still talking.
He and we've got some unfinished business of a personal nature. He's a hard man to catch on his ass. But see, I hear that he's looking for you.
Marcella wasn't surprised. After all, she had cut down his numbers.
You want me to kill Anthony Hutch?
June's expression darkened.
No. I just want you to get me close enough to say hello. And then, as far as I'm concerned, we're square. What do you say? I could do that,
said Marcella, tapping the gun against her leg.
Or I could just kill you. You could,
countered June with a wry smile.
But it wouldn't be me you were killing.
Marcella's brow furrowed.
How's that? Hard to explain,
said June.
Easier to show you. This little dress-up game of mine, it's nothing. But you get me in a room with Tony Hutch, and you'll see what I can really do.
Marcella was intrigued.
Deal. Lovely,
said June, with a sudden dazzling smile. She crossed to the window.
In the meantime, we should probably get out of here. Only a matter of time before they send more. I suppose you're right.
Marcella considered the bodies on her floor.
But it would be rude to go without leaving a note.
Fucking hell, muttered Stell. He'd already passed a scene in the lobby, where the concierge, an older man named Richard Ainsley, lay slumped forward in his chair, his throat slit. The scene on the 14th floor told its own story. Ash streaked across the hall runner, and a fine mist of blood splattered the floor and wall. Stell freed a dart from a neighbor's door. All the signs of a fight, but no bodies. Sir, called Holtz, you should see this. Stell stepped around the dark stains and through the open door into Marcella's apartment. 2 techs were securing the scene, bagging and recording everything they could, but as they stepped out of the way, Stell saw why Holtz had called him in. If you don't kill her now, you'll wish you had. Marcella Riggins hadn't tried to hide her work. On the contrary, she'd put it on display. The 3 agents' bodies, what was left of them, lay on the floor, their limbs arranged in a disturbing tableau. A macabre version of see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. The first soldier, missing a part of his skull, had his hands against his ears. The second, with a broken neck, had his own armored gloves over his eyes. And the third, little more than brittle bones inside a tactical suit, had no head at all. Sitting like a centerpiece on the glass coffee table was a single ruined helmet. How long do you think it will take her to penetrate whatever armor your men are wearing? Stell examined the helmet and found a folded piece of paper tucked beneath. Inside, in elegant, curving letters, there was a single line. Stay out of my way. Stell pinched the bridge of his nose. Where were the rest of the agents? He'd assigned 6 to the mission, 6 operatives for a single EO. It should have been enough, more than enough. We found one by the transport vehicle, said Holtz. 2 more in an alley. He didn't need to say that they were dead. The ensuing silence said enough. Cause of death? Asked Stell quietly. None of them were melted, if that's what you're asking. 1 broken neck, 2 blades, to the throat and gut. Is it possible, ventured the young agent, that Marcella wasn't acting alone? Anything's possible, said Stell. But it did make sense. So far, Marcella Riggins seemed to favor her bare hands or a gun, but 4 of the soldiers he'd sent had been killed in other, more varied ways. Stell looked around. Tell me this building has security.
Closed circuit in the public spaces,
offered one of the techs.
Someone deleted the files, but they were clearly in a hurry. We should be able to pull footage from the lobby and hall.
Good, said Stell. Send it over as soon as you have it. What now? Asked Holtz. Stell ground his teeth and walked out. Roman numeral 8. 3 weeks ago. Eon. Eli turned through Marcella's file. Across the cell, Victor leaned, hands in his pockets, against the wall. For so long he'd thought Victor was haunting him. Now that Eli knew that the man was alive, he knew the phantom was nothing but a figment of his own imagination. A touch of madness. He did his best to ignore it. Footsteps sounded beyond the wall. Eli knew by the tread that it was Stell, and he knew, too, that the director of Eon was angry. The wall went clear, but Eli kept his head bowed over his work.
I take it, he said dryly, that the extraction was a resounding success.
You know it wasn't.
How many died?
There was a long, weighted silence.
All of them.
What a waste,
muttered Eli, shutting the file in front of him.
All in the name of policy.
No doubt you're feeling smug.
Eli rose from his chair.
Believe it or not, Director, I take no pleasure in the loss of innocent life.
He plucked the latest photos from the cubby where Stell had set them.
I only hope you're ready to do the right thing.
Eli turned through the shots from the heights.
She's not exactly subtle, is she?
Stell only grunted. Eli studied the rest of the photos and notes, reconstructing the fight in his mind. He noticed two things fairly quickly. One, Marcella had a flair for the dramatic. Two, she wasn't acting alone. There was the obvious issue of timing and the method of the killings, of course, but for Eli, the most damning evidence was subtler, a matter of gesture, aesthetic. The scene up on the 14th floor was grand, gruesome, theatrical. The killings near the transport van were simple, brutal, and efficient. One was an exhibitionist. The other was a trained killer. Marcella was clearly the first, but then, who was the second? An ally? A colleague? Or simply someone with a vested interest?
She's not alone,
he mused aloud.
You think so too,
said Stell. It was only a hypothesis, of course, but one soon confirmed by the arrival of security footage from the heights. Eli had pulled the files up on his computer while Stell did the same on his tablet, and together they watched in silence as Marcella executed the first two agents. Eli saw with grim satisfaction the appearance of the second figure, a large man who snapped the third agent's neck. And then, as Eli watched, the man became a woman. It happened between frames, the change so sudden it seemed like a glitch. But it wasn't a glitch at all. It was an EO. A shapeshifter, by the looks of it. An insidious ability, one of the hardest kinds of EO to find.
Son of a bitch,
muttered Stell.
I hope you're not going to insist on sparing this new one for the sake of policy.
No,
Stell answered grimly.
I think we've established that neither of them intends to cooperate. We'll have to plan accordingly.
One or two. It makes no difference, said Eli. They may not be human, but they're still mortal. Find them, kill them, and be done with it.
You make it sound simple.
Eli shrugged. It was, in theory. The task itself would be more challenging. It took all his restraint, but Eli did not suggest his own involvement a second time. That seed was too freshly planted, its roots too fragile. Besides, he knew what Stell's next course of action would be. He'd suggested it himself. A sniper at a safe distance, a clean-cut execution. If it went well, no more innocents would die. Of course, if it went well, there would be no need to let him out. Eli tensed. That hand on his, the subtle pressure pushing him forward, pulling him back. For so long, he'd assumed it was God. But doubt was a slow, insidious force, wearing away at solid things. Eli still wanted, more than anything, to believe, knew that to demand proof, to ask for a sign was not the same. But he needed something. And so he told himself, if God willed it, if the mission failed, if it was meant to be, and if it wasn't, if Eli was truly on his own. No. He had seen his opportunity, and he had taken it, and now he had to wait. Had to have faith.
You know what you have to do,
said Eli. Stell nodded.
We have to find them again first.
That shouldn't be hard,
said Eli.
Marcella doesn't strike me as the type to run from a fight.
Roman numeral 9. 3 weeks ago. Downtown. Marcella's steel heels clicked across the lobby of the National Building. June followed a step behind, her steps muffled in her gladiator flats. She had taken on a new aspect. That's what she called them, this time as a lanky girl with shoulder-length black hair and wide, dark eyes, spindly legs jutting from a pair of white shorts. She was barely 16 by the looks of it, and when Marcella had asked, June had simply said,
I heard he likes them young.
Can I help you? Asked the man behind the desk. Marcella settled the sunglasses in her hair, blue eyes and long lashes on full display.
I certainly hope so, she said in a breathy voice.
She had long ago learned how to turn men into puppets. It was simple, no special powers needed. She smiled, and so did the man behind the desk. She leaned in, and he leaned in to meet her.
"We're here to see Tony."
Marcella didn't have an appointment, but June was right. Hutch had been looking for her. He'd left a dozen voicemails on her cell since the card game. Half a minute later, they were on their way upstairs. June slumped back against the elevator wall. She had gone suspiciously quiet, her mouth now pressed into a grim line. Her earlier humor had vanished, her gaze flicking nervously between the number pad on the wall and her own reflection and the gold trim on the ceiling. The elevator chimed, and the doors slid open onto an elegantly appointed foyer, bookended by a pair of men in dark suits, their holsters visible beneath their tailored jackets. Beyond them, frosted glass doors led into the penthouse.
"Gentlemen," said Marcella, stepping forward. Her outfit left little room for concealed weapons, but one of the suits still insisted on patting her down, his hands lingering on her hips and under her breasts. When the other guy reached to search June, she just sneered, and Marcella cleared her throat. "I'm pretty sure there are laws against that." The suit huffed, but stood down, clearly deciding it wasn't worth the fight. He tapped a code into a wall panel, and the frosted doors slid open. The space beyond looked more like a living room than an office. Broad white sofas and low-glass coffee tables, decanters arranged along a sideboard. Tony Hutch sat behind a glossy black desk, reading a paper, the city gleaming in the floor-to-ceiling windows at his back. Beyond the glass, a slate patio gave way to a shimmering blue pool, steam rising where the heated surface met the cool spring air. Tony looked up from his paper and smiled. They say people grow on you, and maybe that was true, because every time Marcella saw Tony, she felt the need to scrub him off her skin. He rose and circled the desk, arms wide.
"Marcella, if beauty were a crime,"
he said, reaching for her hand. "Then I'd be running this city instead of you," she said dryly. Tony laughed, even as his attention flicked sideways.
"And who's this?"
"My niece, Jessica," cut in June, holding out her hand, her accent smothered to a soft edge. Tony took it, his eyes wandering over her.
"Good looks clearly run in the family,"
he said, brushing his lips against her knuckles. With his head bent, he didn't see June's eyes narrow to slits. Marcella wondered again what June had meant by personal business. The two suits were hovering by the glass doors, hands resting on their holsters, but Tony waved them away.
"Stand down, boys."
A wink.
"I think I can handle things here."
Amazing, thought Marcella. Hutch had obviously seen her handiwork at the poker game, and still he treated her like a prop, a pretty but powerless bauble. How many men would she have to turn to dust before one took her seriously? The security retreated, and Tony turned toward the sideboard.
Sit,
he said, gesturing at the two chairs in front of the desk.
"Can I get you girls a drink?"
He didn't wait for an answer, just started scooping ice into crystal tumblers. Marcella sank into a chair, but June wandered the suite, restless, examining the art. Marcella turned her attention to Tony. "Did you know about Bethany?" Tony tutted.
"Oh, that,"
he said, waving it away.
"Look, I told Mark to get rid of her, but you know how men are. If dicks and hearts were in the same place. I mean, how many times have I tried to lure you away from your husband? But then that's not why you're here."
"Why am I here, Tony?" He returned to his chair.
"You're here because you've got the sense to come when you're called. You're here to help me understand what the fuck is going on. Because I've been hearing a lot of crazy shit, Mars. And all I know is 3 of my best guys are dead, and the other 2 seem to have the added notion that it was you who killed them."
"Because it was." Tony laughed, but there was no humor in it.
"I'm not in the mood for games, Mars. I know you and Marcus had a spat."
"A spat," cut in Marcella. "He slammed my head against a table. He pinned my body beneath 50 pounds of iron and set our house on fire with me inside it.
And yet here you are, alive and well, while my top enforcer is a pile of dust on Sam McGuire's floor. So you're going to help me understand what really happened."
He didn't bother to say "or else," only sat back.
"Look, I'm not an unreasonable man. You help me and I'll help you."
Her mouth twitched. "How will you help me?"
"You're always too good for Marcus. I could give you the kind of life you deserve. The kind you're worth."
That slimy smile.
"If you ask nice."
Ask nice. Play nice. Marcella was so fucking tired of nice. Across the room, June let out a short, derisive laugh. The smile slipped from Tony's face.
"Something funny, kid?"
June turned toward them.
"I asked you nice once, Tony,"
she said flatly.
"It didn't make a bit of difference."
Tony's eyes narrowed.
"Have we met before?"
June leaned her elbows on the back of the empty chair and pouted.
"Oh, Tony."
This time, when she spoke, her accent was on full display, strong and sweet.
"Don't you recognize me?"
The color drained from his face.
"No."
Marcella didn't know if it was shock or a denial, but one hand went for the top drawer of his desk.
Really?
June straightened, and as she did, the teen girl disappeared, replaced by a perfect replica of Tony Hutch himself.
What about now?
Marcella watched as the Tony Hutch behind the desk drew a gun from the top drawer and fired 3 quick rounds into June's chest. June looked down as the blood blossomed, sudden and bright across her shirt, but she didn't cry out, didn't fall, just smiled. Behind the desk, the real Hutch gasped and clutched his chest as 3 perfect holes appeared, blood spilling down his front.
What was it you said to me?
Asked June, leaning on the desk.
Ah, yes. Don't fight it, baby. You know you like it rough.
His lungs hitched once, twice, body shuddering to a stop. As the man died, June seemingly lost hold of her powers. The reflection of Tony fell away like clothes that no longer fit, and for an instant Marcella glimpsed someone else, a girl with auburn curls and hazel eyes and freckles like a band of stars across her nose. But it was only for an instant, and then June was back again, as the skinny, dark-haired teen she'd worn into the office. Marcella watched it all in amazement, as the true potential of June's power settled over her. The girl wasn't just a mirror, or a mimic. She was a living voodoo doll. Marcella broke into a grin just as the frosted doors were flung open and the 2 guards barreled in, weapons drawn. June whipped around, no longer the teen girl, but a perfect mimic of the man who tried to frisk her. He raised his gun but faltered at the sight of himself, and in that instant of hesitation, June swept a letter opener from the desk and drove it down into her hand, which was his hand. The man gasped and dropped his gun as blood poured between his fingers. The second guard wavered, the shock of seeing Hutch dead, of seeing his partner suddenly in 2 places, and Marcella took the opportunity to grab Tony's gun from the desk and shoot the man in the head. He dropped like a ball of lead. The other scrambled for his fallen weapon, but Marcella was there first, pinning his wounded hand to the floor with the heel of her shoe. "You crazy bitch!" he bleated, as she bent down and wrapped her hand around his mouth.
"That's no way to talk to a lady,"
she said, digging her nails into his skin. It withered in her grip, flesh peeling back to reveal bone that thinned and cracked until the slightest pressure made it shatter. Marcella straightened, dusting her palms. She swore softly. There was a crack in her manicure. June whistled a low, appreciative sound.
"Well, that was fun."
She was perched on the sofa, legs swinging girlishly. She hopped down and started toward the glass doors, their surface now flecked with blood.
"Come on,"
she said, passing Tony's sideboard.
"I need a real drink."
Roman numeral 10. 3 weeks ago. East Merritt. Marcella had been to her fair share of bars, but these days, most of them had glowing stained glass, leather booths, at the very least a menu. The Palisades had cracked windows, wooden stools, and a grimy chalkboard. It wasn't that Marcella didn't know this world, the world of astringent well-drinks and tabs paid in petty cash, but she'd left it behind on purpose. June, on the other hand, seemed right at home, elbows leaning on the sticky counter. She was herself again, not the girl Marcella had glimpsed so briefly in Hutch's office, or the one June had worn on their way in, but the one she had met at the Heights, with those loose brown waves, that long peasant skirt. June ordered a double whiskey for herself and a martini for Marcella, which turned out to be straight vodka, ungarnished, which at the moment she really didn't mind. She stood at the bar, sipping the drink.
"Fuck's sake, sit down,"
said June, swinging around in her seat.
"And stop wrinkling your nose."
The girl lifted her drink.
"To a good day's work."
Marcella reluctantly perched on the stool, studying June over her glass. She was brimming with questions. 2 weeks ago, Marcella had been a beautiful, ambitious, but slightly bored housewife, with no idea that people like June, like her, existed. Now she was a widow, one with the ability to ruin anything she touched, and she wasn't even the only one with powers.
"Can you be anyone?"
she asked June.
"Anyone I touch,"
said the girl.
"if they're alive, and if they're human. How does it work?"
"Dunno," said June.
"How do you burn people alive?"
"I don't," said Marcella.
"Burn them, that is. It's more like—"
She considered the drink in her hand.
"Ruining. Wood rots, steel rusts, glass returns to sand. People fall apart. What does it feel like?"
Like fire, thought Marcella, but that wasn't quite right. She remembered how it felt when Marcus crumbled in her arms, the simple, almost elegant way he came apart. There was something raw about her power, something limitless. She said as much.
"Everything's got a limit,"
said June.
"You should find yours."
The girl's gaze darkened, and Marcella remembered the space between bodies, the brief glimpse of that other shape.
"Did you feel it?"
she asked.
"When he shot you?"
June raised a brow.
"I don't feel anything. Must be nice."
June hummed thoughtfully, and then asked a very different kind of question.
"Do you remember your last thoughts?"
And the strange thing was, Marcella did. Marcella, who never remembered her own dreams, who rarely remembered a phone number or a catchphrase, who'd said 1,000 angry things in the heat of passion and never recalled a single one of them, couldn't seem to forget. The words echoed inside her skull. "I will ruin you," she recited softly, almost reverently. Now, somehow, she could. It was as if she'd forged the power through her own formidable will, tempered it with pain and anger and the vicious desire to see her husband pay. And so she had to wonder, what kind of life, what kind of death, made a power like June's? When Marcella asked, the girl went quiet. And in that quiet, Marcella felt the girl gaze into her own internal flame. "My last thought," June said at last, "that I would survive, and no one would ever be able to hurt me again." Marcella raised her glass. "And now no one can. And on top of it, you can be anyone you want. Except myself." There was no self-pity in June's voice, only a wry humor. "Irony's a bitch. So is karma." Marcella twirled her glass. "You know my story," she said. "What's yours?" "Private," said June shortly. "Come on," she prompted. June raised a brow. "Oh, sorry. If you thought this was a girls' night out kind of thing, where we get drunk and bond, I'll have a pass." Marcella looked around. "Then what are we doing here?" "Celebrating," said June, tossing back her drink and signaling for another before pulling a slip of rolled paper from her pocket. At first Marcella thought it was a cigarette, but then, as June unfurled it, Marcella realized it was a list. 4 names in tight scrawl. 3 of them had already been crossed out. And there, at the bottom, Anthony Hutch. As Marcella watched, June plucked a pen from the edge of the bar and struck the name out. "Well, that's done," she said, half to herself. And just like that, June was back. A manic light in her eyes as she spun in her seat, folded her arms on the bar. "What do you plan to do next?" Marcella looked into her empty glass. "I think," she said slowly, "I'll take over the mob." June snorted into her drink. "Brilliant." But Marcella wasn't joking. She had only settled for a place at her husband's side because no one would give her a seat at the table. But she was done settling. According to Marcus, power belonged to the man with the biggest gun. Marcella thought of the remains of Tony Hutch's body, staining his white carpet. "How many of us do you think there are?" "EOs," June hesitated. "Who knows? More than you'd think. We don't exactly go around advertising. But you can find them." The glass was halfway to June's mouth. Now it stopped. "What?" "Your power," said Marcella. "You said when you touch someone, you can take their appearance, but only if they're human. Doesn't that mean you can tell when they're not?" June's smile flickered and returned twice as bright. "You're awfully sharp." "So I've been told." June stretched on her stool. "Sure I can tell. Why? You looking to find more of us?" "Maybe." "Why?" June shot her a sideways glance. "Trying to eliminate the competition?" "Hardly." She finished her drink and set the empty glass down, running a gold nail around the rim. "Men look at anyone with power and see only a threat, an obstacle in their path. They never have the sense to see power for what it really is." "And what's that?" asked June. "Potential." Marcella tightened her fingers on the stem of her glass. "This ability of mine," she said, as her hand glowed red, "is a weapon." As she spoke, the glass dissolved to sand, slipping through her fingers. "But why settle for one weapon when you can have an arsenal?" "Because an arsenal stands out," said June. Marcella's lips twitched. "Maybe it should. People with powers like ours. Why should we hide? The life I had is gone. There's no getting it back. I'd rather make a new one. A better one where I don't have to pretend to be weak to survive." June chewed her lip thoughtfully. And then, having answered what private question she'd been pondering, June sprang to her feet. "Come on." Marcella didn't know if it was the girl's sudden, infectious energy, or if she simply had nowhere else to go. But she stepped down from her stool. "Where are we going?" asked Marcella. June glanced back, a wicked light in her eyes. "I'm in the mood for music." If the Palisades had been a dump, the marina was worse. An underground bunker, half bar and half seedy jazz club, and every surface sticky. Small round tables, trimmed by rickety chairs, half of them empty. A low stage along the back wall, bare but for a few instruments and a standing mic. June slung herself into a vacant seat and gestured to the chair across from her. "What are we doing here?" asked Marcella, eyeing the whole situation with suspicion. "Darling," said June, with dramatic flair, "you must learn to blend in." As she said the words, she changed, shedding the bohemian brunette for an older black man in a faded button-down, sleeves rolled to the elbows. Marcella stiffened. The lights were low, but not that low. She glanced around. "Not exactly subtle." June chuckled, her voice smoky in the old man's throat.
I thought you were done with hiding.
She flicked her hand dismissively at the half-empty club.
People can see an awful lot and believe none of it.
The old man rocked backward in his seat, the front legs coming off the floor, as his face vanished into the club's deep shadow. When the chair tipped forward again, June was back to one of her usual selves, loose brown waves tumbling into her face. "Won't you sit?" Marcella lowered herself into the wooden chair as June went on. "Truth be told, I didn't bring you for the music. Not directly. But if you're interested in other EOs, I might have a treasure for you." She drew a phone from her pocket and scrolled through her texts before turning the cell toward Marcella. A single name stood out on the screen. Jonathan Richard Royce. "Who's he?" she asked. "A sax player," said June. "A decent one at that. Or he was, until he went and got addicted to heroin. Finds himself in debt to Jack Caprice." Caprice, thought Marcella. That was a name she knew. Merritt was carved up among 4 men, Hutch, Kohlhoff, Mellis, and Caprice. Hutch had the biggest portion, but Caprice had big eyes, and bigger teeth these days, and a bottomless appetite. "He couldn't break the habit," continued June, "but he couldn't afford it either. So Caprice's men go over to sort out the balance, break a few fingers. Only Jonathan's wife is home too. She pulls a gun, and it all goes sideways. Wife dies. According to medical records, so does Royce. For a few minutes, anyway. But in the end, he pulls through. So Caprice sends more guys around, and those end up dead too. Now no one wants to take credit for a botched kill, and no one wants it getting out that they failed. But for all that, they still need Royce in the ground. So they outsource. They called you." June smiled. "Yeah, they called me. But I couldn't kill him." Marcella raised a brow. "What? You had a change of heart?" "Hardly," said June. "I mean, I really tried to kill him, and I couldn't." Roman numeral 11. 3 weeks ago. Merritt city limits. Jonathan Royce owned one good suit, and it didn't even fit. It had, once upon a time, when he was 30 pounds heavier, but now it slumped and sagged, always on the verge of slipping off. Just like his wedding ring, staying on only because of a twice-broken knuckle. Jonathan had never been a large man, but these days he was all harsh angles, underslept and undernourished. It was ironic, really. Jonathan looked like an addict, even though he'd been clean since Claire's death. Everyone he knew had dabbled. Drugs and music went hand in hand, and the jazz scene was no exception. But heroin was a hell of a high. Not the roller coaster peaks of cocaine or the mellow que sera sera of good weed, but a dreamy wave, a blissful way out of your own life and your own head. A summer midnight swim in the ocean, bare-assed kind of freedom. At first. Jonathan had seen the addiction coming, watched it roll in like a tide, but he was already wet, and he couldn't drag himself back to shore. And just like a high tide, an undertow, it came and washed everything away. Money, joy, safety, sanity. Every day the tide a little higher. Every day the water a little deeper. Every day a little farther from shore. Easy to get swept away. All you gotta do is stop swimming. Jonathan looped the tie around his neck, fumbling with the knot, his fingers aching. It had been nearly a year, and the joint still hurt every day. He wasn't even surprised the night Caprice's men came to visit. He was already high. Claire was out with friends, and Jonathan didn't have their money, and he knew it, and they knew it, and there was the hammer, and his hands. But then there she was, walking in. There was Claire, screaming. There was Claire, pulling out a gun. Where had she gotten that gun? And then there was noise and pain and darkness. Jonathan should have left Merritt after that. Should have bailed the moment he came to in that hospital room with 2 broken hands and 3 bullet holes in his stomach and chest. But Claire's blood was still mingled with his on their kitchen floor, and he just couldn't bring himself to go. It just didn't make sense that she was dead, that he was not. Claire didn't deserve it, didn't deserve this, to become a past tense, a footnote in someone else's story. And Jonathan had the strange but unshakable idea that he hadn't made it either. That he was a ghost, anchored to the place where it all happened, bound there, until some grim business was done. So he stayed, and wore that one good suit he had to her funeral, dripped ash on it, chain-smoking cigarettes in a cheap hotel room afterward, waiting for Caprice's men to find him and finish the job. Funny thing, but until that night when Caprice's men showed up, Jonathan had never killed anyone before. He thought it would be harder. It should have been harder. Should have been impossible, considering the number of men, the number of shots fired. But so much about that day was impossible. The blue-white shine, like a shield, knocking their bullets away. The cacophony of sound and violence, and when it was over, Jonathan, standing alone among the corpses, unscathed, untouched. In his rare metaphysical moments, Jonathan thought it was Claire looking out for him. But in his masochistic moments, of which there were far more,
He knew it was punishment, the universe mocking him for what he'd failed to do. The clock chimed 7, and Jonathan knotted his worn-out tie. He slid on the jacket, picked up his saxophone case, and headed to work. His breath fogged before him as he walked, this part of Merritt already dark, like it couldn't be bothered with streetlights. It was a half-mile to the marina, a patch of Merritt they'd labeled Green Walk on the map, another bit of irony, considering there was nothing but stone and asphalt in every direction. The ghost of Green Walk. That was him. The man who couldn't die. He was already— "Hey!" snarled a voice. "Give me your money!" Jonathan hadn't heard him coming, hadn't really been listening, but he felt the barrel jab into his back, a single nervous thrust, and he turned to find a kid, maybe 16, gripping the gun in both hands like it was a bat. "Go home." "You deaf or stupid?" growled the kid. "Don't you see this gun? I said give me your fucking money." "For what?" "Or I'll fucking shoot you." Jonathan tipped his head back, looked at the sky. So shoot. Half the time, they didn't have the balls to fire. This one did. Not that it made any difference. The gun went off, and the air glinted around Jonathan, like a flint striking stone. That shine, like Claire's arms around him, telling him it wasn't his time. Wasn't his turn. The bullet ricocheted, flung into the dark. "The fuck?" said the kid. "Quit while you're ahead," warned Jonathan, right before the kid emptied the magazine at Jonathan's head. 7 shots, and 6 of them rebounded uselessly into the dark, sparkling off bricks, asphalt, shattering a window. But the last bullet snapped back and hit the kid in the knee, and he went down screaming. Jonathan sighed and stepped over the writhing form, checking his watch. He was late for work. The marina was half empty. It was always half empty. Jonathan recognized most of the people who did show up, but something was different. He knew the moment he stepped in, like the air was full of snow. It was the 2 women near the back, the one like something out of a catalog, red lips and glossy black hair, the other younger, with a mane of brown curls and a dangerous smile. They watched him the whole set. Maybe once upon a time he'd drawn that kind of attention, but that was back when his hands could do better, back when he fit into the suit, back when his smile came easy, mostly because he was already high. Jonathan was checked out. He made it through his set, hit the notes by habit instead of passion, and then went to the bar, carried on a wave of weak applause and a strong tie of self-loathing. "Club soda," he said, slipping onto a stool. He could still feel eyes on him. Every now and then, Caprice sent someone around to try again, but it never took. Those 2 women didn't look like Caprice's usual killers, but maybe that was the point. He heard the neat click of the heels a second before the knockout appeared at his shoulder. "Mr. Royce." Her voice was warm and sleek, and laced with smoke. The brunette hopped up on a stool. "Johnny boy," she said, and there was something about her accent familiar, as if they'd met before, but he was sure he'd never seen her face. "If Caprice sent you," he muttered. "Caprice," said the dark-haired woman, turning the name over in her mouth. "He's the one that killed your wife, right?" Jonathan said nothing. "And yet," she continued, "Jack Caprice is still alive, flourishing, I've heard, while you're here in this shithole of a club, wasting away." "Oi!" chirped the other woman. "I like this place." "Who are you?" asked Jonathan. "June," said the brunette. "Marcella," said the black-haired beauty. "But when it comes to people like us, the real question isn't who, is it? It's what." The woman pressed a single gold nail against the bar, and as Jonathan watched, her finger glowed red, and the wood beneath began to warp and rot, wearing a hole straight through. The brunette, June, slid a coaster over the damage, only she wasn't the brunette anymore. She was Chris, the Palisades bartender, even though Chris was still on the other side of the counter, back-turned while he polished a highball glass. By the time he turned back, so had she. Jonathan's mouth went dry. They had powers, like his shine. But the shine was a gift. The shine was a curse. The shine was his. There weren't supposed to be others with him, here, in this hell. "What do you want?" he asked, voice barely a whisper. "That," said the beautiful woman, "is what I was just about to ask you." Jonathan stared down into his club soda. He wanted his life back, but he had no life. Not anymore. He wanted death, but he'd been deprived of that too. That night, after Caprice's men were all dead and Jonathan wasn't, when the room was silent and dark and the world was empty, he had put the gun to his head and pulled the trigger, and that should have been the end of it. But it wasn't, because the shine was there again, like it or not, and that made him think of Claire, and how pissed she'd be, him throwing away a second shot. And thinking of Claire made him want to get high again, to float out to sea, but the shine wouldn't let him. Jonathan had told himself that he wouldn't try again. He wouldn't let her down. But it was like a whole new kind of drug, using that shine. a fearsome reminder that he was still alive. June was frowning, as if she could read Jonathan's mind, but Marcella smiled.
"Why sit around sulking," she said, "when you could hurt the people who hurt you?"
But he had hurt them. He'd killed the men who killed Claire, and the ones who came for him, and everyone else Caprice sent. Every single one. Except Caprice, murmured Jonathan. Was that why the shine wouldn't let him rest? Why he couldn't get to Claire?
"I can help you get to him,"
said Marcella. She leaned in, close enough for him to smell her perfume.
"I've heard a little about your talent, but I'd love to know more."
She reached out and brought her fingers to rest against his arm. It was such a simple gesture, almost kind, right up until her palm flared red. The shine flashed along his skin, and she pulled back, considering her hand. She said, as if she hadn't just tried to ruin him.
"How do you do it?"
"I don't do anything," said Jonathan bitterly. "It just happens. Someone tries to hurt me. Hell, I try to hurt myself, and it's there, shielding me."
"Well, bully for you,"
said June, leaning back on the counter. Marcella made a small, displeased hum.
"I don't see how that helps me."
Jonathan stared into his glass. "I can share it." Marcella's blue eyes narrowed.
"What do you mean?"
Jonathan shook his head. This was how the shine mocked him. How he knew it wasn't a gift at all, but a curse, a shallow cut, not deep enough to kill, but more than enough to hurt. He just wanted to protect Claire, and he'd failed. Now, when he finally could, it was too late. She was already gone.
"Jonathan,"
pressed Marcella. "I can shield someone else," he admitted. "So long as I can see them." Marcella smiled. It was a dazzling smile, the kind that made you want to smile back, even when there was nothing to smile about.
"Well, in that case," she said, "let's talk about revenge."
Roman numeral 12. 3 weeks ago. Somewhere outside of Brinthaven. Victor's steps rustled in underbrush. It was almost dusk, the sky sinking into violent shades around him as he picked his way through the woods. Now and then the silence was punctuated by distant gunfire as, across the reserve, hunters picked off their prey before the last of the light failed. Victor was hunting too. He trailed a broad man in an orange vest, the shock of color picking him out from the surrounding mottle of green and gray. The trees were sparse, surrounded by fields to every side. A few miles south, a small cabin, the full extent of the man's footprint. Despite his current attire, Ian Campbell had been a hard man to find. He'd gone off the grid after his accident, a disappearance almost as complete as death. Almost. But in this day and age, it was impossible not to leave a mark. It had taken Mitch months to track this particular EO down, but he'd done it, because he knew, just as Victor knew, that they were running out of options. The stack of paper had dwindled down to a few spare sheets, and as the leads shrank, the length of Victor's deaths grew, the seconds ticking upward until they threatened to brush that lethal edge, the medically established threshold of no return. A soft bleeding sound alerted Victor to the likely object of Campbell's attention. An injured deer lay in the brush, its side opened by a scattering of buckshot. As Victor slowed to watch from the shadow of a nearby tree, Campbell crouched over the injured deer, making gentle noises as he laid a hand on the animal's side. And then, as Victor watched, the buckshot rose back up through muscle and skin and rolled down the animal's sides into the grass. Victor's breath caught. He had become so accustomed to disappointment, to tracking EO after EO down, only to learn that their powers were incompatible or worse, irrelevant. So he was caught off guard by the sight of Campbell's power, the realization that he'd finally found someone who could help. The deer rose on unsteady legs and then bounded away through the trees, unhurt. Campbell watched it go. Victor watched Campbell. "Is it a kindness?" asked Victor, his voice breaking the stillness. "To loose prey back into the world, simply to be shot again?" Campbell, to his credit, didn't jump. He straightened, brushing his palms against his jeans. "Can't do much about the hunters," he said. "I never could pass up a creature in pain." Victor laughed, a humorless, hollow sound. "Then you should have no qualms about helping me." Campbell's expression narrowed. "Animals are innocent," he said. "People are another matter. Most, I've found, don't deserve the help." Victor bristled. It sounded like something Eli would say. His fingers twitched, the air beginning to hum. But Campbell surprised him by stepping forward instead of away. "How are you hurt?" he asked. Victor hesitated, unsure how to answer such a simple question with such a complicated answer. In the end, he said, "Mortally." Campbell gave him a long, measured look. "All right," he said. "I'll do what I can." Victor's heart stuttered, not from an episode, but from hope, a thing so rare he'd forgotten what it felt like. He had been prepared to use force. "There are limits," continued Campbell. "I can't stop nature. Can't change its course. I can't rewind death, but I can undo a violence."
"Then," said Victor, whose deaths had been shaped by blood and pain, "you are well suited to this."
Campbell held out his hand, and Victor, who had never been comfortable with contact, forced himself to still as the EO's hand came to rest on his shoulder. Campbell closed his eyes, and Victor waited. Waited for humming in his skull to disappear. Waited for the crackle in his nerves to ease, and the ticking clock to finally stop. But nothing happened. After a long, empty second, Campbell's hand fell away, and Victor knew that he'd found another dead end. But he'd seen Campbell's power. It should have worked. It had to work. "I'm sorry," said the man, shaking his head. "I can't help you."
"Why not?"
snarled Victor. For the first time, Campbell backed away. "When I said I could, I meant I can heal a violence done by someone else. But whatever's happened to you, however you're hurt, you've done it to yourself." Victor's anger sliced through him like a knife, sudden and deep. His hand clenched into a fist, and Campbell staggered back into the brush, a pained sob wrenching from his throat. "Get up," demanded Victor. But he raised his hand as he said it, forcing Campbell upright. "Fix me."
"I can't,"
gasped Campbell.
"I told you, I can only heal the innocent. You're not a victim."
"Who are you to judge me?" growled Victor.
"No one," said Campbell. "The power judges for itself. I'm sorry, Victor shoved Campbell away with a snarl. Behind his eyes, he saw his death.
Not the most recent, or the one at Eli's hands, but the very first, the one in the lab at Lockland. The way he'd climbed onto the table, pressed his bare back against the cold steel, summoned death to him like a demon, a slave, an order. In the woods, Campbell had struggled back to his feet. Victor half expected the EO to run, but he didn't. Darkness had swept in around them, but even in the lightless woods, Victor saw the genuine sadness in the other EO's eyes. Victor briefly considered letting the man go, but if he'd found Campbell, it was only a matter of time before Eon did too. Their reach seemed farther by the day.
"I'm sorry,"
said Campbell again.
"Me too,"
said Victor, drawing his gun. The shots echoed through the woods. The body collapsed, and Victor sighed and slumped back against the nearest tree, the humming louder than ever in his head. He closed his eyes, suddenly, immeasurably tired. If you kill all the EOs you meet, how are you better than Eli? Whatever's happened to you, however you're hurt, you've done it to yourself. His cell broke the silence. Victor dragged his eyes open and answered the call, rising to his feet. "Dominic." He heard the telltale sounds of a bar in the background. "You have news?" "There's a new EO," said Dom. "A bold one. Name's Marcella Riggins." "Is she a viable lead?" asked Victor as he started back the way he'd come. "No," said Dom. "Her power is definitely of a destructive nature." Victor sighed. "Then what is she to me?" "I just thought you'd want to know. She's just drawing a lot of attention." "Good," said Victor shortly. "Then Eon can waste their time hunting her instead of me." He knew, of course, thanks to Dominic, that they were already chasing him, or rather chasing someone, and he had a good idea who was leading the charge. Victor had been disgusted, but not surprised when he'd learned about the way Stell was using Eli Ever, putting him back to work. Eli always did have a knack for finding his way to the center of a stage, and Stell had fallen for his charms before. Victor wondered if that was why Eon hadn't gotten closer, not because their pet had failed to see Victor's hand in the killings, but because he had. It would be so like Eli, that self-righteous, self-absorbed need to handle things himself, and every day the noose failed to tighten. Victor's suspicions grew. As for Marcella Riggins, let her have the spotlight, as long as she could hold it. When it came to EOs, there was a kind of natural selection. Most had the sense to stay in the shadows, but when the need for attention outweighed a sense of self-preservation, the scales tended to balance themselves, and people like Marcella never lasted long. Roman numeral 13. 3 weeks ago. Just outside Merritt. Rain slipped through the warehouse roof, the steady drip of water masking the clip of Marcella's heels against the concrete floor. The old cannery sat on the outskirts of town, a skeleton of pillars and steel beams in a rotting roof, one of the designated parcels of neutral ground in the city. Their voices drifted through the bones of the building.
"In his own office.
He can't stand.
Who's going to handle? Just one woman. No way she's working alone."
"What is it with men in places like this?" mused Marcella, her voice loud enough to carry as 3 heads came into sight. "I swear, you always pick the most morose places to gather." The men turned toward her. Joe Koloff, Bob Mellis, Jack Caprice. She'd half expected to find them sitting at another round table, these self-proclaimed knights of merit. But instead she found them huddled in the center of the dreary, leaking space. Unbelievable, thought Marcella. Her husband reduced to ash. Tony, dead at his desk, and yet they still didn't even bother to draw their guns. Neutral ground rules dictated that bosses didn't carry, but surely no one actually went into a meeting like this without at least one piece of artillery.
Is it the ambiance?
Marcella wondered as she made her way toward them.
Or does like simply call to like? Defunct, outdated, obsolete. So many old buildings in this city, she said, nails trailing across a concrete pillar. It's insane the money they waste on repairs and refurbishments. Sometimes it's better to just raise the whole thing and start fresh, don't you think?
The once late Marcella Riggins, sneered Koloff. You've got some nerve.
Oh, I like to think I've got a great deal of nerve, Joe.
If you had a damn bit of sense, said Melis, you would have run.
In these shoes,
she teased, glancing down at her steel heels.
And missed this lovely meeting.
You weren't invited, said Koloff.
What can I say? My ears were burning.
How did you find us? Demanded Caprice. Marcella wandered between the pillars, nails skating over concrete.
My husband used to have a saying, knowledge may be power, but money buys both.
Her hand fell away.
Turns out some of Hutch's men were more than willing to change sides in exchange for a promotion.
Bullshit, hissed Caprice. Family doesn't turn.
Marcella rolled her eyes.
The amazing thing about these families of yours,
she said, dragging her hand along another pillar,
is that they're only family to the ones on top. Head far enough down the tree, and you find a whole lot of people who don't really care who's in charge, as long as they're getting paid.
She let her eyes wander to the warehouse wall, the lot beyond, where half a dozen black sedans idled.
I wonder how many of your men will jump at the chance to work for me, the moment you're gone.
Koloff bristled. Melis drew a knife from his back pocket, flicking it lazily open. Caprice, finally, produced a gun.
I always thought you were a brazen bitch, he said, training the barrel on her. But you're obviously a stupid one, too, coming here alone.
Marcella continued her path between the pillars, unconcerned by the weapons.
Who said I came alone?
Jonathan's dress shoes tapped out a rhythm on the concrete as he came into sight. He moved, as if in a trance, his dark eyes trained on Caprice as he walked straight toward him. The mob boss squeezed off a shot, and the bullet struck the air in front of Jonathan with a burst of blue-white light before ricocheting off, sparking on the concrete floor.
What the fuck?
Snarled Caprice, firing again and again as Jonathan closed the distance between them, bullets skating off before one finally bounced back, hitting Caprice squarely in the knee. He gasped and buckled, clutching his leg. Jonathan didn't say anything. He simply drew his own gun, aimed at the kneeling man's forehead, and fired. Koloff and Melis froze, their eyes wide as Caprice's body slumped, lifeless, to the cold ground. Marcella clicked her tongue, pressed her hand flat against the final pillar.
If you had a damn bit of sense,
she said, red light seeping from her palm,
you would have run.
The concrete beneath her hand gave way, and as it did, the other pillars began to shudder and lurch, each already weakened by her passing touch. The building let out a heavy groan as the columns crumbled, and the roof bowed, buckled. Melis and Koloff were running now, but there was no point. June had already locked the doors. A massive chunk of stone came crashing down, Marcella in its path. She watched it fall, fascinated, limbs fizzing with excitement and fear. "Jonathan," she said, but he was already looking, and the air around her shimmered with blue-white light just before the rubble struck. Rocks shattered against the force field and slid off, raining harmlessly down around her. Marcella remembered the first time she witnessed a demolition. The thing that struck her most after that initial boom was the quiet grace, the way the whole behemoth had sagged sleepily, sinking less like a mass of bricks and steel than a failed souffle. It was admittedly a little less peaceful from this angle, and not nearly as quiet. But Marcella savored it all the same. Savored the men's screams, the warping metal in the broken rock, and the way the whole world shook as the building fell down around them, burying Koloff and Melis and Caprice. 3 more men who'd stood in her way. The wreckage carved a circle of destruction around Marcella, around Jonathan, leaving them unharmed, though barricaded, contained. But there was nothing that could hold her now. Marcella brought her fingers to the nearest block of concrete and pressed, her whole hand flaring crimson, a violent light spreading like fire up her arm. The concrete weakened, cracked, shattered, the obstacles laid to waste, the path made clear. Marcella had yet to test the limit of her power, or rather had yet to find it. The destruction came so easily. She strode out of the ruined building, Jonathan trailing like a shadow. June was waiting at the edge of the rubble, eyes wide.
That wasn't exactly subtle.
Marcella only smiled.
Sometimes subtlety is overrated.
June gestured to the suited men spilling out of the waiting black sedans.
And what do we tell the cavalry?
Marcella considered the men.
Let's tell them,
she said,
that the Merit mob is under new management.
Marcella collapsed onto the cream leather sofa, laughter bubbling across her lips.
You should have seen their faces, June.
The city stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass, glittering in the last shards of light. Marcella had always wanted to live in the National. Now that she was here, Hutch's penthouse felt like a temporary stop on the way to bigger, better things, but it was still a pretty one. Especially now that the blood had been scrubbed out. A few stubborn flecks remained, but Marcella didn't mind them. No, they were reminders of what she'd done, what she was capable of doing. Enemies reduced to stains under her feet. As far as the standard personnel were concerned, Tony Hutch had gone on holiday, something he was prone to do. He's always been a man of many vices, used to his privacy. Jonathan slipped like a ghost down the hall, but June lingered, perched on the edge of the sofa.
You know,
She said,
one body doesn't draw much notice. The trouble is when they start adding up. Mob boys don't exactly phone the feds every time someone bites it, but you're testing them. Do you not remember what I said about Eon? All the more reason to stand out.
June crossed her arms.
How do you figure?
Marcella curled a clump of black hair absently around one finger.
When people stay in the dark, it's easier to make them disappear. She sat up. I just brought down an entire building. You can be anyone you want, and Jonathan can render us untouchable. We're not just impressive, we're invincible. We should stand out.
June shook her head.
If you want to survive. But I don't want to survive,
Sneered Marcella.
I want to thrive. And I promise you, I'm just getting started.
The girl rolled her eyes.
What now? You're going to throw yourself a fucking party?
A slow smile spread across Marcella's mouth. It wasn't such a bad idea.
No,
said June.
No, that was a joke.
A gunshot went off from another room.
Damn it,
hissed Marcella, rising to her feet. June followed, and together they found Jonathan standing in one of the bedrooms, the gun hanging limply from his fingers, a hole in the far wall where the bullet had ricocheted.
What are you doing?
Demanded Marcella. Didn't work, he murmured. Thought it might. Now that Caprice is gone.
Sorry, Johnny,
said June.
Apparently you've still got work to do.
He sank onto the bed, head in his hands. Just wanted, he said, gripping the gun in both hands, to be with Claire. Marcella sighed and pulled the weapon from his grip. His moroseness was killing her buzz.
Come on,
she said, turning on her heel.
We all clearly need a drink.
She didn't look back, but she heard Jonathan drag himself up from the bed and follow them into the main room. June was in a restless mood, trading one aspect for another with every step. An old woman with a tattooed sleeve, a young black man in a tailored suit, a pretty 20-something in a white mini-dress.
You're making me dizzy,
snapped Marcella. June slumped onto the sofa and took on a new aspect. She wasn't Marcella, couldn't be, but she was clearly meant to be close. Porcelain skin and black hair and legs for days. The face was too wide, the eyes green instead of blue. They followed Marcella to the sideboard, lining the wall, with its collection of rare, expensive bourbons. She set the gun on the crystal top and poured Jonathan a few fingers of something dark and strong. No ice.
You missed quite a speech,
said June.
Our girl's got big plans.
Marcella didn't rise to June's baiting. She handed the drink to Jonathan.
That's right,
she said.
And you're clearly meant to be a part of them.
Marcella turned to June and offered her a glass.
What about you, June?
She wasn't just asking about the drink, and they both knew it. The other EO shook her head, but she was smiling, a playful, almost dangerous light in her eyes.
I've said my piece. Do as you please. After all, if Eon comes calling, they won't catch me.
June took the drink, and Marcella held up her own.
A toast to bigger, better.
The window shattered behind them. The bullet would have caught Marcella in the back if Jonathan hadn't been staring at her. Instead, it ricocheted in a burst of light, followed in quick succession by 3 more, shots whistling through the air. One of them struck June. She stumbled, fell, her shape sloughing away as she did. For a second, barely a fraction of a second, Marcella saw the girl's true form again, the auburn hair, the band of freckles. And then that person was gone, replaced by a stranger, launching their body out of the line of fire.
I told you,
started June.
Not the time,
snapped Marcella, as a decanter nearby exploded into glassy shards.
Keep your eyes on me,
she ordered Jonathan. And then she turned, set down her glass of whiskey, and took up her gun. The shots continued, a hail of fire that turned the air blue and white as Jonathan's force field reflected every shot. Marcella moved with a careful, calculated grace, forcing herself not to flinch amid the onslaught. It was exhilarating, knowing that her life wasn't, for the moment, in her own hands, knowing that if Jonathan looked away, the shield would fall, and she'd be hit. But sometimes you have to have a little faith. Marcella marched across the penthouse to the shattered floor-to-ceiling windows, the jagged rim of glass gaping open like a mouth. She touched the edge, and the remaining shards crumbled, crystals caught up and swept away by a gust of cold night air as Marcella stepped through the empty window, heels grinding on glass and sand and debris. This, she thought, crossing the balcony, is why you don't hide. This, she thought, lifting her own gun, is why you let them see your strength. Marcella squinted through the flash and spark of Jonathan's shine, trying to find the flares of light that marked the sniper's rifle in the dark as she fired, again and again, emptying her clip into the night. Roman numeral 14. 2 weeks ago. Downtown Whitten. Sydney ran her fingers over the small bones. Doll had found the bird in the gutter earlier that day, if it could be called a bird. It was a gnarled mess of sinew and feather, a single ruined wing. It was pitiful to start with, and worse still after Sid had pried it from the big dog's mouth, and now it lay sadly on a worn kitchen towel atop her borrowed bed. Doll watched, his chin resting on the comforter. Somewhere beyond the doors, Mitch was making dinner and humming an old song. They each had their own ways of coping with the stress, the fear, the hope. She turned her attention to the bird.
What do you think?
She asked Doll. The dog sighed, still sulking over the stolen prize. She scratched his ears. The closer he was, the stronger she could feel the threads that bound them, and the easier it was to remind her fingers what they were searching for. Sydney took a deep breath, glanced at the red metal tin beside the bed, and then closed her eyes. She felt her way forward, let her hands come to rest on the sad remains, and reached. It felt like a long fall. It felt like emptiness and cold. It felt like forever. And then Sid registered the faint blush of light, the twist and curl of a thread. No, not a thread. A dozen wisp-thin filaments, fragments, scattered across the black stretch behind her eyes. They swam across her vision like fish, darting away from her touch, and Sydney's lungs began to ache. But she didn't give up. Slowly, painstakingly, she gathered the filaments, imagined fitting the frayed threads back together, knotting them. It took hours, days, years, and only an instant. As she tied the final knot, the thread glimmered, pulsed, became a flutter of feathers against her palm. Sydney's eyes flew open as the bird moved beneath her fingers. A sound escaped her throat, half laugh, half sob, a mixture of victory and shock, and then the sound was overtaken by the furious wing beats and the squawk of a very surprised pigeon trying to escape the confines of her grip. It pecked at her knuckles, and Sydney let go, a rookie mistake, as the bird took flight in the narrow room, searching for freedom, bouncing off the light fixture in the window, Doll bobbing his head as if trying to catch airborne apples. Sydney lunged for the window and threw it open, and the bird escaped into the night in a flurry of gray feathers. She stared after it, amazed. She'd done it. It was a bird, not a human, but Sydney had still taken only a few mangled bones and made the creature whole, brought it back to life. In seconds, she was across the room, prying the lid off the red metal tin. The last, the only pieces of Serena Clarke lay nested inside, wrapped in a scrap of fabric. Sydney reached for them, heart racing, and stopped. Her hand hovered over the remains. What if it wasn't enough? A bird wasn't a girl. If she tried and failed, she'd never get another chance. If she tried and failed, but what else could she do? The rest of Serena was ash, scattered across a city hundreds of miles away. Would it make a difference? Sydney had never wondered if the where mattered as much as the what. But now, as she nestled the lid back on the tin, she thought, ghosts are tied to the place where they died. She didn't believe in ghosts, but she had to believe in something. That thread of light, the closest thing she could find to a soul. If there was any of Serena left, beyond the bones in this box, it would be there. Sydney would just have to wait. Roman numeral 15. 2 weeks ago. Capstone. Stell's plane had landed at dawn. He didn't know why a video conference wouldn't suffice, but the board had insisted on his presence, and short of outright defiance, Stell had had no choice but to go. In his absence, he'd left Rios with strict instructions. No procedures were to be put into effect in his absence. No commands given or followed, unless they came expressly from him. The last thing Stell needed was a mutiny. Now he stared across the nondescript conference table at 5 nondescript faces atop nondescript suits. Stell suspected that by the time he left the room, he wouldn't be able to pick any of them out of a lineup, let alone a crowd.
First a failed EO capture,
said the woman in black.
Now a failed extermination.
You've made quite a mess, added the man in gray. We've faced difficult EOs before, said Stell. It's only a matter of time.
Only a matter of time, cut in the man in black, before Eon and its interests are both dragged into the spotlight.
My team is doing everything we can, said Stell.
That isn't strictly true, said the man in black. We called you here because we believe your personal bias has prevented you from utilizing every asset at your disposal.
Bias, challenged Stell.
We don't deny,
added the woman in navy,
that you've been integral to the development of this organization.
Development? I created Eon. I brought you the first intel.
I explained the threat level. Hell, I had to convince several of you of the very legitimacy of EOs. The man in charcoal cleared his throat. We are not questioning your contribution. The man in gray leaned forward. We know you have a strong personal attachment to the early ideals of this organization.
Which is why,
said the woman in black,
you're not objectively qualified to judge its current needs.
My subjectivity is an asset, said Stell. You seem to think we're dealing with manufactured weaponry here. Only I seem to realize we're dealing with people. A case could be made, said the man in charcoal, that they are both. Stell shook his head. It always came back to this, to money and power and the board's desire for both. If the board had their way, they'd turn each and every captured EO into a weapon, preferably single use.
Marcella Riggins makes a mockery of Eon, and of you,
said the woman in navy.
You claim you are doing everything you can, using every tool at your disposal, and yet you keep settling for low-range munitions when you have one perfectly suited to the task.
He understood then, with painful clarity. Eli. At least low-range munitions have safety catches. Eli Cardale does not. I won't authorize him for use in the field. The man in charcoal sat forward. You yourself have advocated for this kind of utility. This is different, said Stell. Eli isn't an ex-soldier. He's a mass murderer. One who has been cooperative for more than 4 years. Stell shook his head. You don't know him like I do.
And so we return to the issue of objectivity,
said the woman in navy. Insight isn't the same as bias, snapped Stell. You think we have a mess on our hands right now. It's nothing compared to what would happen if we set him free. Who said anything about free? Asked the man in black. There are countermeasures. According to our records, tracking devices were installed. It's not just a matter of losing Eli, said Stell. It's what he'll do before we find him again. He can't be controlled. At this, the man in gray produced a briefcase. With that in mind, he said, sliding it down the table. A sturdier solution. The clasps came open to reveal a smooth steel ring, nested on a bed of black. When Stell reached in, he discovered it was actually 2 rings, one pressed into the other. A seam ran along each circle, so that the fused collar could hinge open and closed.
Haverty's methods were admittedly problematic,
said the woman in black,
but in this case they were also useful. His initial tests explored Cardale's general ability to heal. His second series explored the extent of that healing, and its limitations. A small remote, flat as a credit card and half as wide, lay impressed in the fabric beneath the collar. A single button on the smooth, dark surface. Haverty discovered a threshold. Anything smaller than, say, a pill, and Cardale's body could absorb it. Anything larger, and his body would physically reject the intrusion. However, if he was unable to reject the object, his body could not heal.
Stell thought of Eli, awake on the operating table, his chest pinned open as Haverty worked.
We've had R&D on this project for months. Go ahead. Try it.
Stell pressed the concave button, and the collar's inner ring collapsed, folding at the seam so that the band of metal transformed into a vicious spike. It's designed, explained the man in black, to sever a human spinal column between the 4th and 5th vertebrae. In an ordinary person, such an injury would result in permanent paralysis. Due to Cardale's condition, the effects would obviously be temporary, but they should be just as effective.
This is, of course, only a suggestion.
The woman in navy shot him a thin smile.
You are still Eon's director, after all.
Stell returned the collar to the case, the board's logic warring with the lead weight in his stomach.
But we would strongly advise you to handle this EO, and handle her swiftly, using any and every means necessary.
Back in Merritt. Stell's house key always stuck in the lock. He knew he should get it fixed, but he didn't spend much time at home. Slept in his own bed one night in 3, ate most of his meals in Eon's canteen. He wasn't sure what made him drive from the airport into the city instead of back toward Eon. Didn't even realize what he was doing until he was halfway there. But his head was still cluttered from the meeting with the board, and the 2 whiskeys on the plane had done nothing to clear it. And Stell realized he didn't want to step through those doors until he knew exactly what he planned to do. About Marcella. About Eli. Stell shrugged out of his coat, lit a cigarette, even before he set the steel briefcase on the kitchen table, slid the clasps. The smooth metal collar sat, nested in its velvet groove. You are not using your assets. Was the board right? Send me. Stell lowered himself into a chair. He will never see the outside of this cell. Was he letting his past color his judgment, or was he just listening to his gut? He rubbed his eyes, took a long drag of the cigarette, filling his lungs with smoke. The collar glinted in its case, Eon's solution, but not Stell's. Not yet. His cell rang. Stell answered without looking at the screen. Hello. He'd expected Rios or a member of the board, but the voice on the line was smooth, sultry.
Joseph,
it said with all the warmth of an old friend. He frowned, stubbing out the cigarette. Who is this?
You really have to ask.
Do I know you?
I should hope so. After all, your men have spent a great deal of time shooting at me.
Stell's fingers tightened imperceptibly on the phone. Marcella Riggins.
If I didn't know any better, I'd think you had something against me.
How did you get this number? He could hear the smile in her voice.
I'm getting tired of killing your agents. Are you getting tired of burying them?
She didn't wait for him to answer.
Perhaps,
she continued,
we could find a more sophisticated solution.
Most EOs only get one chance, said Stell. I'm giving you two. Surrender now and...
A soft laugh. No, Joseph, she chided. Why would I do a thing like that?
So you just called to gloat?
Not at all.
Then why?
I thought, she said airily, perhaps we could get a drink.
That, at last, caught Stell off guard. To what end? He demanded. So you can try to kill me?
That would be pointless. If I wanted you dead, you would be. You think this number is the only thing I know? I have to say, your choice of decor is tragically bland.
Stell's head snapped up.
Of course,
she went on.
You're really not home much, are you?
Stell said nothing, but shifted so his back was to the wall, his eyes on the windows.
Only a few photos,
she went on.
2 sisters, I presume, by the way they look at you.
You've made your point, he said, through clenched teeth.
Well, in that case, I'll be at Kanika Bar around 7. Don't make me drink alone.
Before he could answer, she hung up. Stell slumped back against the wall, head spinning. He couldn't go. He shouldn't go. Marcella was a target, an enemy, someone to be dispatched, not negotiated with. But he had to do something. He looked from the steel briefcase to the cell phone in his hand. Stell swore under his breath and grabbed his coat. Roman numeral 16. 2 weeks ago. Downtown Merritt. Some women spent years planning their wedding. Marcella had spent the last decade planning a hostile takeover. Of course, she'd always assumed Marcus would be the face of it. But this was far more satisfying. With the 4 heads of the Merritt mob so cleanly dispatched, and the factions thrown into chaos, a chaos bolstered by rumor and eyewitness testimony, the bulk were already scrambling for solid ground. So many, so willing to serve. There would be scuffles, of course, and Marcella was prepared for those, ready to subdue the ones who would invariably vie for control, ready to pay off the officials who might get in her way. There was still the matter of Eon, but Marcella had a play for that too. She put her back to the window, surveying the room. Jonathan polishing his saxophone in a chair, June perched on the spine of the sofa, playing on her phone. With Hutch's suite at the National ruined, they'd taken up residence in an uptown penthouse at First and White, one with windows made of reflective glass. Fool me once, thought Marcella, as someone knocked. Jonathan answered the door, stepping aside to reveal a trim man in a silk suit.
Oliver.
Marcella smiled at the sight of him, smiled wider at the rack of clothes filling the foyer. Between the house fire and the incident at the Heights, Marcella was in dire need of a new wardrobe. Shit, Mars, said Oliver. You've got some heavy security downstairs. Felt me up, down, and in between.
Sorry, she said. It's been a busy week. Excuse me for being a bit wary at the moment, said June. But who the fuck is this? This is Oliver, said Marcella cheerfully. My personal shopper.
June burst into raucous laughter.
People are trying to kill you, kill us, and you've got time for a fucking wardrobe change.
Oliver smirked. Spoken like someone who doesn't understand the power of appearance.
That's so.
June hopped down from the back of the sofa. She moved toward Oliver, taking on and shedding a different appearance with every step.
Maybe you should explain it to me.
Oliver went very still.
And that, said Marcella dryly, would be June.
His gaze shifted unsteadily back to her.
I, heard about Marcus. Hell, I heard about you. Lots of strange talk.
Whatever you've heard,
said June.
It's probably true.
Marcella gestured at Jonathan, standing in his worn-out suit.
Ollie, did you bring what I asked for?
In reply, Oliver pulled a garment bag from the rack and unzipped it far enough to reveal the sharp black suit. Marcella plucked it from Oliver's hand.
A gift,
she said, offering the bag to Jonathan.
Nothing for me?
Inquired June.
You already have a full closet,
said Marcella. She turned toward the bedroom.
Come on, let's see what you've brought.
By the time he started unzipping dress bags, Oliver had regained his usual color.
Gotta say, I was a little surprised to get your call,
he said, adding hurriedly.
And glad, of course. You always were my favorite mannequin.
She plucked a few blouses from the rack as Oliver began to lay out dresses on the bed. For a moment the image overlaid with another in her mind, the garments left waiting atop tousled sheets. Marcella let go of the blouse in her left hand before she ruined it.
You have outdone yourself,
she said, eyes traveling over the array. a lace halter trimmed in black leather, a crimson blazer with sharp shoulders and tapered wrists, a black gown with a dipping collar and a silk obi tie, a line of perfect steel-heeled shoes. She lifted one. The polish was so high Marcella could almost see herself in the shine. Red lips and black hair painted themselves on the metal finish, her reflection warping, as if she were on fire. Oliver turned his back while Marcella stripped and donned a short red dress that drew a clean line across her shoulder blades. She considered herself in the bedroom's full-length mirror, let her eyes travel appraisingly over the burns that traced along her left collarbone, the inside of her right forearm, the top of one pale thigh. They were healing, the skin slipping from pink to silver.
"That one's stunning on you," said Oliver at Marcella's back.
Her eyes slid past her own reflection just in time to see him draw a slim switchblade from his bag. Marcella didn't flinch. "Zip me up," she said lightly.
"Of course."
Oliver started toward her, and Marcella waited until he was almost at an arm's length away before turning suddenly. He slashed, and she caught the knife in her hand, her palm already glowing red. Before the weapon could so much as scratch her skin, it had crumbled. "What a pity," she said, wrapping her other hand around Oliver's throat. "You had such good taste." He managed the beginnings of a scream before the skin and muscle gave way to bone, and then ash, and then nothing. "Christ," said June, appearing in the doorway. She took in the scene. "Well, that's what you get for having a personal shopper." She nodded at Oliver's remains. "Is there anyone who doesn't want to kill you?" "Occupational hazard, it seems," said Marcella. "So it seems," said June. "And how long do you think before our friends at Eon try their luck again?" Marcella turned back to the mirror, flicking a stray bit of ash from the hem of her dress. She met her reflection and smiled. "Let me worry about them." Roman numeral 17. 2 weeks ago. Kanika Bar. A long chandelier rippled across the ceiling, spilling soft light over crystal and marble and clean linen. Stell adjusted his tie, grateful he was still dressed from the meeting at Capstone. "You have a reservation, sir?" asked the maitre d'. "I'm meeting someone," said Stell cautiously. "I'm early, but—" "You can wait at the bar," said the maitre d', nodding to a curve of glass and oak. Stell ordered a whiskey several shelves higher than his usual brand, and scanned the guests, some of the most powerful and prominent people in Merit. The district attorney, the mayor's wife, corporate heads and politicians, and more than one star athlete. He saw her as soon as she arrived. It was impossible not to see her, even in Kanika's low light. She was dressed in red, not exactly subtle, but nothing about her would have ever merited that word. Her black hair curled in loose waves around her face. Her lips were the same shade as the dress, her eyes a striking blue. Stell had seen photos, of course. None of them did Marcella Riggins justice. Stell could sense other heads turning as she made her way to a table in the center of the restaurant. He took up his glass from the bar and followed. When she saw him, a smile broke the sharp line of her red lips. "Joseph," she said, wielding his first name like a weapon. "So glad you decided to come." Her voice was warm, tinged with smoke. "Miss Riggins," said Stell, sinking into the chair opposite. "Morgan," she corrected, as a glass of red wine was laid at her elbow. "Given all that's happened, I no longer feel inclined to use my husband's name. But please call me Marcella." She spoke with an airy confidence, one gold nail toying with the rim of her glass, and Stell realized that it wasn't Marcella's beauty that had failed to translate in any of the photos he'd seen. It was something else. Something he'd seen before. In Victor Vale. In Eli Ever. A rare kind of strength. A dangerous will. Someone this powerful belongs in the ground. Suddenly he understood Eli's stance, the stubborn resolve behind his declaration. Stell's hand drifted toward his holstered gun. "If you don't kill her, you'll wish you had." His fingers brushed the safety. But Marcella only laughed. "Come on, Joseph," she said. "I'm sure you've noticed. Weapons don't really work on me." Stell had seen the footage, of course. Marcella on the shattered balcony, the sniper's shots skating off the air around her. He'd also seen the image of the thin man in the dark suit. The one, he realized, who was now sitting several tables over, wearing sunglasses, despite the restaurant's low light. The set of the man's shoulders, the angle of his face, suggested he was staring directly at them. "Another EO," Stell wagered. "Don't mind Jonathan," said Marcella. "It's not that I don't trust you, Joseph," she added congenially. "But, well, we're still getting to know each other." A fresh whiskey appeared at Stell's elbow. He didn't remember finishing his first, but the glass was empty. He lifted the new tumbler, took a sip, and stopped, recognizing the taste. It was a brand Stell kept in his apartment, one that he only poured when he had something in particular to celebrate. Marcella smiled, knowingly. Her long legs uncrossed and recrossed, high heels glinting like knives at the edge of his sight. "Tell me," she said, twirling the wine-glass stem between her fingers.
Do you have the place surrounded?
No, said Stell. Believe it or not, I'm not eager for anyone to know I'm sitting down with a terrorist. Marcella pursed her lips.
It will take more than harsh words to wound me, Joseph.
The way she used his name, as if he were the wine-glass between her fingers, something to be toyed with. You wanted to meet, he said curtly. Tell me why.
Eon,
she said simply. What about it?
You seem to target us because of what we are, not who. That kind of indiscriminate attack is short-sighted, to say the least.
Marcella leaned back in her seat.
Why make another enemy when you could have an ally?
An ally, echoed Stell. What could you possibly offer me? A slow crimson smile.
What do you want? Less violence? Safer streets? Organized crime really has gotten out of hand lately.
Stell raised a brow. You think you can change the course of the mob? Marcella's smile shone.
Haven't you heard? I am the mob now.
She rapped her nails on the linen tablecloth.
No, you want to deal in kind, don't you? A more relevant currency. You want EOs.
You would hand over your own?
My own what?
Marcella scoffed.
Who are they to me?
Stell looked past her again to the man in the dark suit. Marcella read his expression.
I'm afraid June and Jonathan are not up for trade. They belong to me. But surely there are others, ones that have eluded your grasp.
Stell hesitated. Of course, some EOs were harder to catch than others, but there was only one that had proved so far impossible. There is an EO, he said slowly. One who seems to be targeting their own kind. He didn't elaborate, didn't share Eli's theory regarding their motivations. So far, they've killed 7 other EOs. Marcella's eyes widened in mock surprise.
Isn't that your job?
I don't approve of needless death, said Stell, regardless of whether the victim was human or not.
Ah, a man with morals.
My morals are the only reason I agreed to this meeting. Because I'm tired of burying good soldiers.
And because you haven't figured out how to stop me,
said Marcella. Stell swallowed, but she waved him away.
This is a last resort. Why else would you sit down with a terrorist?
Do you want a ceasefire, or not? Asked Stell tightly. Marcella considered her wine.
This EO, am I to search in the dark, or will you give me a starting mark?
Stell drew a notepad from his pocket and scribbled down a list. He tore the sheet off. The last 5 cities where the killer struck, he explained, sliding the paper across the table. Marcella slipped the sheet into her purse without reading it.
I'll see what I can do.
You have 2 weeks, countered Stell. It was long enough to produce results, but not long enough for Marcella to waste time. She was right, and she was wrong. This wasn't the last resort. Stell did have a way to stop her, but it wasn't the one he wanted. 2 weeks would give him time to think, to plan, and if he couldn't find another option, then 2 weeks was how long he had to decide which was worse. Letting Marcella walk free, or Eli?
2 weeks,
mused Marcella. That's how long this service buys you, said Stell. If you succeed in producing the killer, then perhaps we can continue to find common ground. If you fail, then I'm afraid your value to Eon will not merit your continued freedom.
A man who knows what he wants,
said Marcella with a feline smile. There is another term. You will stop drawing so much attention to yourself.
That's going to be hard,
she teased. Then stop drawing attention to your power, clarified Stell. No more public demonstrations, no more grand displays. The last thing this city needs is a reason to fall apart.
We certainly wouldn't want that,
said Marcella coyly.
I'll find your target for you, Joseph. And in exchange, you will stay out of my business and out of my way.
She lifted her glass.
Do we have a deal?
Roman numeral 18. 2 weeks ago. Eon. Eli studied the footage again and again. The mission at the National should have been simple, but nothing about Marcella Riggins was proving simple. You should be celebrating, said Victor's ghost. Isn't this what you wanted? Eli didn't answer. He focused on the footage from the scene, advanced the surveillance 1 frame at a time, watching as the glass shattered. The bullet, which should have taken Marcella in the back of the head, ricocheted, sparking off an invisible shield. Eli paused the footage there, rapping his fingers thoughtfully on the table. The odds of a single EO possessing more than 1 power were slim to none. No, it was far more likely, he surmised, that this particular skill belonged to the 3rd, as yet unidentified EO, the one lurking like a shadow at the very back of the room. 3 EOs, working together. That itself was unusual. The vast majority were loners, isolated by either necessity or choice. Few looked for others, let alone found them. We did, observed Victor. It was true. Both Eli and Victor had arrived at the same conclusion, that there was strength in numbers. potential in the complementary pairing of powers. Now, apparently, so had Marcella. Eli rolled the footage forward and watched her step through the hail of bullets onto the balcony, watched as every single shot ricocheted, watched as she raised her own gun in the general direction of the sniper. There was something so brazen about the gesture. EOs ran. EOs hid. Under pressure, an EO might fight back. But they didn't do this, didn't perform, didn't use their powers with such obvious relish. EOs were broken by definition, made reckless by the absence, the emptiness, the knowledge that their lives were over. It drove them to steal, to ruin, to self-destruct. Marcella wasn't self-destructing. She was preening, baiting them, daring them to try again, try harder. She had taken out her husband, and that made sense, an act of revenge, of closure. But then she'd taken out his competition. That wasn't the mark of someone with nothing to lose. No, that was the mark of someone with something to gain. That was ambition. And ambition plus power was a very dangerous combination. What would she do, if left unchecked? The phantom in his head was right. He'd asked for a sign that he was needed, that this was right. Marcella couldn't be allowed to continue in this manner. And soon Stell would realize, if he hadn't already, that Eli was the only one who could put her down. Footsteps sounded from beyond the fiberglass, and he looked up from the computer as Stell appeared on the other side of the wall.
"There you are,"
said Eli, rising to his feet.
"I've gone through all the footage from the failed execution, and we're obviously going to need a much more tailored approach, especially considering there are—" Eli trailed off as Stell set a new case file in the tray. "What's that?"
"We got a hit on a suspected EO 2 hours south of Merritt."
Eli frowned. "And Marcella?"
"She isn't the only target we're tracking."
"But she's the most dangerous," said Eli, "and in the last 3 days she's collected 2 more. What are we going to do about—"
"We aren't going to do anything," said Stell shortly. "Your job is to analyze the files I give you. Or have you forgotten that you exist at the mercy of Eon?"
Eli clenched his teeth. "There are 3 EOs working together in Merritt, and you're just going to ignore them."
"I'm not ignoring anything," countered Stell. "But we can't afford another failed op. Marcella and her partners need to be handled cautiously. You have 2 weeks to devise the more tailored approach you spoke of."
Eli drew up short. "Why 2 weeks?"
Stell hesitated at that.
"Because," he said slowly, "that is how long I've given her to prove her worth as an asset."
Eli reeled. "You made a deal? With an EO?"
"The world is not black and white," said Stell. "Sometimes there are other options."
"Where were mine?" snapped Eli. "The lab or the cell? Those are the only ones I was given."
"You killed 40 people.
"And how many has she killed already? How many more lives will she destroy by the time you see fit to put her down?"
Stell didn't answer.
"How could you be so stupid?"
"You will remember your place," warned Stell.
"Why?" demanded Eli. "Tell me why you would make a deal with her." But Eli knew. Of course he knew. This was how far Stell was willing to go to keep him in this cage, contained, controlled. "What did you mean," he said through gritted teeth, "when you said her worth as an asset?" Stell cleared his throat.
"I've given her a mission. A chance to succeed where you have failed."
Eli stilled. No. The open file. The unsolved case. Victor. "The hunter is mine," he growled.
"You've had 2 years," said Stell. "Perhaps it's time for fresh eyes."
Eli didn't realize he'd approached the fiberglass until he slammed his fist against it. This time the gesture wasn't calculated. It was pure rage. A moment of violent emotion turned to violent action. Pain flashed through him, and the wall hummed in warning. But Eli's hand was already falling away. Stell's mouth twitched, a grim smile.
"I'll leave you to your work."
Eli watched the director go until the wall went white,